I'd like to sort of hand over to the first speaker, and who is going to give us a sort of garden archaeological outlook on especially paths, but also some walls, I think. Andreasson Sjögren, who works at the Stockholm University, the Department of Archaeology and Classical Studies. She's done a lot of archaeological surveying of pathways. So, yeah, I think without stealing too much of your time, I'm just going to hand over to you, Anna, to sort of start the day.
Yeah. Should I start sharing screen then?
Yes, you can do that.
Let's just hope everything works perfectly. First we do this.
Yeah.
And I can't see the view.
It's there in the visa, yeah. There we are.
Here.
Lovely.
Okay.
Looks great.
This looks good.
Yeah.
Good.
And if you want to present yourself anymore, feel free to do that before you start off, if there's anything I sort of missed.
Yeah, I even put it in the talk so I wouldn't
forget. Great. Okay.
There we go. I am an archaeologist mostly. I have worked as a field archaeologist since 1996 and almost exclusively with gardens since 2008 and from 2013 then at the Stockholm University. And I usually say that the oldest garden I worked with was Roman Iron Age in Sweden, in Scania. And the youngest one was built in the 1970s or 1990s. And you can approach all these gardens with a physical archaeological view. And that's kind of what I do. I work with both plant remains above and below ground. And most of the time, the past years, I've been working very much on my PhD, but also doing a little bit of other things. And it's going to be more of that lately. I have a company also, Archaeogarden, that you can find on the web where my publications are, etc. Now, I'm going to talk about the garden remains. And it's important to remember that they were shaped by construction and management. The physical record, the archaeological record in any garden with a history is the result of activities that were both to shape and maintain the garden. The bottom pictures here you can see it has to do with laying turf and maintaining a turf garden. And all these activities, they affect the soil layers below, and we can find, if we learn how to identify them and examine them, we can also learn a lot about how a garden was maintained. Another good example is like the compost, for example. If you use household compost, your garden soil will have all those little bits and pieces in it. And earlier they were often misinterpreted as garbage dumps, but in fact it's actually garden soil. And all kinds of activities, they all leave their marks on the garden. And when we work with a garden, we want to find the history of a particular garden. Really, we need interdisciplinary cooperation. Many sources and many methods of research needs to be combined. At least in the Nordic countries, we usually don't have many traditional historical sources like images and written sources to gardens. Usually what you have is a tiny little bit of a map perhaps, and just bits and pieces, and you need more. But there is also another important reason, and that is that many things were never mentioned in written sources. A lot of that is where the physical sources come in. Now, the physical record provides us with more and different types of knowledge. We have archaeology. That's the first thing that usually comes to mind when I talk about my work. But archaeology is not just soil and things. It's also archaeobotany, and geology. Those are the specialists that we work with most often. The archaeobotanists and geologists that can look at the micromorphology of soils. But there are all kinds of ways of looking at the botanical and geological remains. We also have the buildings and the features above ground as important, really. I mean, the garden never stops. You know, on the up above and below ground is just as important. When we talk about the features above ground, we should also look at the living plants, cultural relic plants, for example, that old plants that are surviving in edges and borders, sometimes not in the original places where they were put, but in the places where they have survived, which might be behind a stone wall, for example. And also people. I'm not sure everybody would agree with me when I say that people are also physical sources, but in a way they are, because there is a lot of tacit knowledge that is not written down, that you have to ask, you have to search in different ways to find interviews, trials and testing, etc. So we need to combine all these sources, and every garden is different. Every garden is unique. So how we combine them has to be up to the particular garden. And today I'm going to just tell you a little bit about a few paths that I have worked with and what they look like from an archaeological point of view. And there I'm going to mention 5 sites, 2 in Norway and 3 in Sweden. And I will also talk a little bit on dry walls at the end. Just for one method that you will hear about again and again in this talk is the ground penetrating radar. It's a method that has been developed a lot in the last couple of years. And today it's really a good way to find, for example, paths, because they give very good reflection. All those tiny little stones have surfaces that reflect. So usually paths show up as white or black stripes very well. But if you do, it's important that you space your lines close enough, or even maybe use a grid method as on the right side there. And it works. You collect your information by going back and forth in lines. And then you have a powerful computer software. And this is where the development has been most most things have been happening lately. You make a 3D model of what you have measured, and then you slice it horizontally to interpret it. So this is what's behind the images I will show you. And we're going to start with Krapperup in Sweden, which is a garden that is still there today. And we know the oldest traces of it we have is from the 1680s. And the job that we were put to do in this case was to find the perimeter path of the formal garden, the one that was showing on images from the 1680s, because it was going to be restored so that it would be easier for the public to actually see where this part, what this oldest garden was. And when we dug, well, you can see the GPR on the right. This was done in 2007, so a lot has happened since then. But as you can see, the gravel path or the sand path is very clear. It can be seen quite clearly. And this path was probably the bottom layers that you see there, all the different little lines, is probably the oldest garden. It was preserved underneath for all the time that the garden was used. As you can see on the pictures in the right corner, it was still there in the 30s and the 40s. But since they never dug there, they never mixed up the soil, so we can see all the generations of path underneath. And the older path was like between 2 and 2.1 meters. The remain is you can see it's two different layers, the yellowish white sand that was locally sourced, and in between layers of mixed with topsoil, so they are very gray, more grayish. And we interpret this as the path has been renovated and changed or several times. But of course, it's not just garden paths in former gardens that you can find. And then we go really far in. This is a very recent project in Stockholm, the Rosendal Castle at Djurgården in Stockholm, where the DPR in 2019 was sent to try to find the lost paths of the Royal Landscape Garden. And as you can see on the image to the right, the blue lines are what the DPR found, and the map of the garden in 1834, well, they match quite well. And the little red lines show where we dug trenches to look at the garden. And the garden paths, we actually only looked at them in two different places, but well, said different places, but you can actually see it quite well. It was the same kind of gravel or sand in the whole area, probably because it was, you know, put arranged or shaped at the same time. The widest, there are three widths of garden paths, but the widest ones was 2.5 meters. And you can see it as a sand layer, again, mixed 70% sand, 20% gravel on top of the natural soil, which was a grayish yellow clay here. So maybe that's one reason why it showed so clearly. We had the help of a geologist, Jens Heimdal, at Archaeological. He's a great resource because he is both an archaeobotanist, our most experienced when it comes to gardens, garden remains, and he's also a geologist. So he looks at both the micromorphology or the morphology of the soil and the plant material. And you could see that the gravel was in this place naturally sharp or slightly rounded. So they will have interlocked quite well. But there was only one layer of sand put directly on the topsoil. We go straight to another place. This is Fossesholm in Norway, quite far south in Norway. And the garden probably existed between 1760 and 1822. It was today there is only a lawn. There are no traces above ground, but in this place where the former garden was, but there is a project to reconstruct it, and that's why the archaeology was done. This path, that my example here in the middle, was a main path, main east-west axis, and it leads from the door to the courtyard and in the house. So it was an important main axis. And what you could see there was that the top layer was a dark gray sand with quite a big mix of sizes of stones, or and it was mixed with red and gray granites, but also quite a lot of black slate. You can see the washed sample in the corner, in the left corner of the difference, the two layers, the top layer and the bottom layer. The top layer was quite dark, a lot of black in it, but the bottom layer almost only brown. So this doesn't look like they were collected from the same place. It might be that there is the bottom layer that was very homogeneous, very compact, and the sizes of the stones in it was like 1 millimeter. Maybe it's some kind of like construction layer, and then they put the top layer on it. Maybe it's two different generations. I am not sure, and I would really like a practitioners' views on these, because that's when we learn how to interpret these things, if we discuss it together with people who actually know how to make paths. The dark sand at the top was mixed, both this dark gravel, but also a dark gray silt that sort of bound the top layer together and must have made it quite hard. And you can also see the bombering, well, you know what I mean, the shaping of the bar so that the water will run off. It must have been quite hard. See, and we are going to straight to another place in Norway, Eidsvoll, which was renovated in 2014 in a great jubilee. It's a national treasure, a national monument, because it's the place where the Norwegian constitution was written. And the path, well, I'm going to show you two different paths from this garden. The first one is probably a younger one. It seems like it was made in 1860. We have a map from a garden design map when they changed from a formal to a more landscape garden or layout for one of the first jubilees of the Constitution. The width is about 2.5 meters. The sand is grayish brown and very small stones and quite compact as well, with some silt in between so that it stays together. On the sides, you have the typical fuzzy lines, and probably my interpretation is that it's because of the edge cutting, that if you repeat edge cutting again and again, then you will have a fuzzy lines on the sides and not very clear cuts. So again, a trace of management and maintenance. The middle part also, and I'm not sure if you can see it on the image, but there are very thin lines in the sand, colored. Mostly it's just a color difference, like more grayish and more blackish. And the suggestion we've had is that it's because of packing, perhaps some like maintenance when they were packing the sand to make it harder, but also maybe the water has influenced this so that this has become like this. Underneath, there is a layer that doesn't seem to have been affected by this practice in the same way. So these are not really two layers, it's just a difference within a very homogeneous sand layer. And but in Eidsvoll, you could also see older paths in some places. All this is just looking at the remains that came up during the restoration project. Everything that was changed in the garden, all digging. We did archaeology first, because all this would have been destroyed during the it was destroyed during the restoration. But thanks to the fact that I could be there and document, we know all these different things just because, you know, we had the chance to document them first before the restoration. The older path, bit of older path that we could find, it was a lined, like a striped kind that you saw in the first picture at Krapperup. It looked very much the same. With a lighter yellowish brownish sand layers, and then in between them more or less the same kind of sand but mixed with darker materials. And at the top you can see the one I put the letter 1 on here. It was remains of the younger part, the 1860s part, and it was the same as on the other side, same gray sand. But underneath, in this place, there were the remains that probably are older than. Yeah. Okay, so this is my last example. I hope I'm in time more or less. And I'm not.
You have 10 minutes, so
10
you're
minutes.
good. Yeah.
Oh, very good. Because this one is going to take a little longer because it does have the dry wall. It also has a different kind of path that made us really, well, we didn't really, it took us quite some time to interpret what this was and how it was shaped. But first, you have the retaining wall. Well, actually, this place of the garden was created in the 1780s in a formal style, and then changed in the late 1800s into what you can see on the image in the right corner, the aerial image from the 1940s. But the thing is that this was just put on top. They evened it out and they put it on top. So the remains of the parterre from the 1780s was, well, most of it was preserved quite well underneath the more landscape influenced garden from the late 1800s. The retaining wall was holding the parterre. When we dig, you can see that some of it has been removed when they wanted to make it more smooth or more flat for the next generation of garden. But you can see a lot of details in it. It's field stones. They are on the left side is the one that you could see, and it's very straight. With they have chosen the really nice flat surface on the stones. On the other side, you can see that it has not been as carefully done, and you can also see that they have been putting soil on this side, like filling up with soil. Originally, it was 4 layers of stone, we think, which means it would have been about 80 centimeters high. But around the garden, there was also a wall, same kind of stones. You can see it as a comparison, the ordinary dry wall that was surrounding the garden on the image at the bottom here. And there is also just the bottom layer of the visible stones. Underneath this is probably like a foundation area, foundations made. If we have time, I'm going to show you just 1 second, like a little example of that too, what it might look like. But the parterre is also very interesting. These squares were 13 times 17 meters, and the edges were formed by what looked like very thin or narrow paths, like gravel, sand, and then in the middle and a soil where the soil had been prepared in a different way, and then another thing that looked like a very thin path. Look, all these were like about 50 centimeters wide, and it's natural gravel. It's much coarser, like bigger stones than any of the paths I've been telling you about before. The gravel in this was between 50 to 450. I missed a 0 there. So between half a cent, well, yeah. They were really like that. It was coarse gravel without the tiny sands. Which made us think that maybe it was more for show. And it has been reconstructed in 2019, as you can see at the top right side, with two paths with a boxwood tiny hedge and in between. So this wasn't really a path that was meant to be walked on. It was meant to be seen from this middle room here, for example, was very like elaborately made, and the view. There really wasn't there was no door to the garden on this side of the house. You had to walk around the house to get into the garden, but it was connected to the house by the windows, and you looked out on top these. So they are simple in design, but they were probably quite like striking, especially in this small town, Jönköping, in the middle of southern Sweden at the time. Another detail here is that the soil wasn't mixed with well, it was very sandy, and not with nothing really like topsoil or like well, it makes us believe that it was a grass lawn, and to have a grass lawn you need lean soil. Lean and sandy soil would have been perfect for a lawn in this area, for example. And also in the bottom corner you can see the pink lines are the way it showed up. You can actually see both the later path that is coming across and these paths that showed up as white lines almost on the GPR because of all these tiny little surfaces that reflect so well. Find a wall is actually harder, because then you really need to you need close lines. In this case, it would have been quite good reflection, but if there is a little bit of gap in between the stones, you can actually almost miss them. They would not have shown ironically, the stone wall does not show as well as the path. I'm just going to show you this. This is from Fossesholm, and this was a very difficult. We think that there was terracing next to the former garden at the bottom, but it was quite difficult to see because it had been, all the big stones had been removed, and the soil had been flattened, or everything had just been flattened out, and then new soil put on top for lawns and things, just quite well destroyed or removed. But we think that the layer 10 here is the base, like underneath the stones that have been removed. And in that case, it would have been about 1 meter high. And then you also, of course, there would have been some of it underground. And this part here, there was also a ditch system or a drainage system underneath the former garden that consisted of ditches dug into the bottom layer, underneath everything, and filled with stones. So you had a drainage system of ditches filled with stones underneath the gardens, well, everything in the garden. But this is what it might look like actually when we come and everything has been removed or changed. But you can still see the traces of it if you know what you're looking for. Okay, so thank you. I hope I have kept my time.
You did.
Good.
And thank you very much. And as I just wrote in the chat, you guys feel free to write your questions in the chat, and yes, especially in the Q&A, and then we will get to them after the next speaker.
And also, if you want to discuss, maybe even the thing is that we haven't gotten so far in the interpretation. We need really your help as well to interpret these details, like the layerings and what is the trace of what kind of practices and things like that. So I'm very glad to discuss these things also at another time, perhaps, or if we have time here.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a good basis for like practical research.
This
like
needs
applied.
to be,
yeah,
exactly. And you need to really, because the laying out of a garden, of course, is important, but then the practice that has been going on for sometimes 200-300 years have also left their marks, and we need to understand all these relations.
Yeah. Thank you very much. So we'll see you again after the next speaker.